Alright, hello guys, welcome back to another Xenoblade X video. This time I'm going to be fighting Telethia the Endbringer using the Longsword Raygun build. This is going to be a non-overdrive build, which is... I don't do many non-overdrive builds just because overdrive is such a core mechanic to the game, but this is a build that I'm very proud of, and I think that it's very interesting and a different approach to the game than a lot of overdrive-centric builds. So I am running a Borchglaive Receding Rust for my longsword. I could run Diamond Spatha instead, but I don't think that would be as good because my potential is so low, so there's not a whole lot of benefit from the potential boost. And I'm just running an Ether Raygun with Arts Gain TP. The Raygun's not overly important. Even though I'm not going to be in overdrive, having TP is still going to be important for making sure I can keep my ores and use my TP arts. Aside from that, just kind of the usual stuff as far as gear goes. Resist control, resist sleep, and resist topple are all very important. Then for attribute resistances, ether and physical, with more emphasis on ether if you can. The only other big thing to note is that I'm running aura rapid cooldown on my my body wear, and the reason for this is that without the overdrive cooldown boost, I'm going to be waiting a lot longer to use my arts, and having anything to help reduce that is very much appreciated for a build like this. The other thing is I'm running weapon attack power up, which I don't think I've used on any builds yet. And the reason why I'm using this is basically I'm going to be using both TP and non-TP arts for damage. And with how low my damage is going to be, and the fact that I'm not going to have a whole lot of additive multipliers, weapon attack power just scales better with this build than something like Appendage Crusher would, which I believe I have used in other builds. So to go into my arts, I'm running two auras, Defensive Stance and Offensive Stance. To briefly describe what these do, Offensive Stance increases your melee damage, but increases the damage you take back, whereas Defensive Stance is the opposite, where it reduces the damage that you take and also gives you healing, but it greatly reduces the damage you're doing with melee attacks. If you're familiar with the Xenoblade series in general, these can be compared similarly to Rage and Berserker on Rhine, where Defensive Stance is a defensive aura that boosts your defenses but lowers your attack, and Offensive Stance raises your attack but lowers your defense. Aside from that, most of my arts are pretty standard for DPS. Blossom Dance is one of the strongest arts in the game with a 700 hit scaling and ignoring attribute resistances. Rising Blade, Tornado Blade, and True Stream Edge are all just powerful melee arts for the longsword. Clarity Ray is my cleanse art, which is very important for any build against most super bosses. It also grants ether resistance up, which is very helpful. And Gravity Cloak isn't really important to the build, it's just there as an extra art I can spam during the lure in order to keep my TP up. And finally my skills. So I'm running Fast Forward and Secondary Accelerator, similar to Aura Rapid Cooldown. These are important for making sure that I can actually use my arts, since the cooldowns are going to be so long without the boost from Overdrive. Aside from that, Brain Wall is very, very useful for fighting against Telethia, as it gives you 100 sleep and control resistance when you have an aura active, which you always should. And then Core Crusher and Aura Assault are just two very good skills to have for DPS on a physical ether build. With that, I think I'm just going to go ahead and get into the fight. I'm going to be explaining some stuff as I go on with the fight, as per usual, but there will be one big difference where, again, without the overdrive, I'm not going to be doing as much damage, and I'm not going to be using my arts as quickly, so I will probably be explaining some things that are different with overdrive builds versus non-overdrive builds. So because I have Core Crush, I'm going to want to make sure I'm targeted onto an appendage, and hopefully Telethia will be within range. Melee. Yeah, it looks like she is, so I can go ahead and pop Defensive Stance to start off. And go ahead and get a combo going. So I really want to be using my arts only whenever I have the secondary cooldown, because they just do so much more damage with the secondary cooldown as opposed to just the primary cooldown. I also want to be getting as many melee combos in as I can to reduce the cooldown. I also want to make sure I always have an aura up, which usually isn't a hard thing to do, but without the cooldown reduced from overdrive, it can be a little bit hard to maintain, which is one of the reasons why I have 2 auras. Another thing worth noting is that defensive stance isn't very important to the first phase, since Telethia's attacks are generally a bit weaker. Her defenses are pretty low and it's easy to just wear her down. But during the second and third phase, it will be very important to have defensive stance for survivability. And without... Alright, disconnect from the server. I don't think there's much left to say for phase 1. Just, yeah, Telethia's already going down. You just want to make sure your auras are off cooldown whenever you go down. So during phase 2, Telethia gains access to physical arts, which do a lot more. Because my physical resistance is not as maxed out as my ether resistance, those are going to be doing a lot more damage than the ether arts that I've been only taking 1 damage from. And this is the reason why defensive stance is so important for this build. So go ahead and pop my aura. So I'm going to start with offensive stance just to make sure I can get some early damage in. But as I start, you can see I'm starting to take damage already. And whenever I've taken too much damage, I'm going to want to pop defensive stance in order to heal up and prevent myself from dying. The other important thing to know about this phase is that you can see my art cooldowns are going a lot slower. That's because Telethia has a spike that inflicts slow arts, which reduces the cooldown speed. And because that it just means that you're going to have to be a lot more patient during this phase than you are in phase 1 or 3 in that regard. The reason why I always combo Rising Blade into offensive stance is that Rising Blade is just a very fast cooldown art, which means that it's not as important for me personally to make sure it's on a fast cooldown, or that it's getting the cooldown boost from a melee combo, as compared to something like offensive stance, which has a much longer cooldown, and I really don't want to be stuck without it for a long period of time. I'm going to use offensive stance here again without waiting for the secondary cooldown. It's going to reduce my damage slightly, but this phase is probably going to be ending relatively soon, so I don't think that's going to be too big of a problem. Hopefully without another defensive stance cycle. I'm going to use defensive stance just to be on the safe side. So once again, it's going to be a little bit before I finish this phase, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it is what it is. And with the secondary cooldown, the offensive stance, I'm doing a lot more damage in this phase, should be ending soon. Yep, there we go. So I'm just going to wait on my auras a little bit before I follow Telethia up in the sky, just to make sure that I do have decent cooldowns on them. And now begins the Lure phase. So this is both faster and slower than in the overdrive builds, because I don't have to worry about building overdrive count. However, I do still have to be worried about my TP consumption and making sure that I have auras up. And since my cooldowns are so much slower, I'm going to be having to refresh my auras pretty often. Just go ahead and make sure Telethia's aggroed. And now I can start heading down. Hopefully my skull will wake up soon. Alright, cool. There's not really a whole lot to say during the first part of the the lure. It's just the same as usual. Just make sure you keep your auras up, TP up, and just slowly bring Telethia down. So as long as I keep an aura up, it doesn't matter too much about which aura is up, because as long as I am cleansing off the ether resistance down, I shouldn't have too much trouble with the damage I'm taking just due to my ether resistance. I did not mean to do that. Did that cancel my aura? No, it did not. So now I'm wanting to keep the longsword out. So one of the differences between overdrive and non-overdrive is that during overdrive, your arts will get secondary and tertiary cooldowns regardless of which weapon you're holding. Whenever you're out of overdrive, you'll only receive the secondary cooldown on weapons that, or on arts for weapons that you are currently holding. So if I want to be getting my aura secondary cooldowns, I'm going to want to be holding my longsword. If I want to be getting the cooldowns on Clarity Ray, I'm going to be wanting to hold the Raygun. I'm going to go ahead and use offensive stance just to make sure I have a active aura, and I'm going to go ahead and use grab and cloak so I can hold my Raygun and start getting the secondary on Clarity Ray. Go ahead and cleanse off the ether res down. I'll also make sure Telethia is not coming in close before I run back. Yeah, it looks like this is close she's coming. So this is going to be a launch, and I'll start running back over to her after it. So one thing that's worth mentioning, I'll just mention it now because I'm about to start wearing down the Soul Reed, is that whenever Telethia's Soul Reed ends, she will use another aura that will have a ether spike. And ether, I don't know if it's proximity or counter, I think it's proximity. But because of that, you really want to make sure that you are cleansing the ether res down very quickly whenever you are grinding through her Soul Reed, because that can do a lot of damage to you very quickly if you're not careful, and can very quickly end your run. Aside from that, you're going to want to keep it in aura active, because if you get put to sleep, Telethia will follow up with an electric attack that will also kill you if you're not prepared for it. During this part, it doesn't really matter which aura you have active because you're not doing damage. I'm going to go ahead and cleanse that off before I die. Did not mean to use offensive stance there, but it doesn't really matter. Now is just the part where I spam my arts and try and wear down Telethia's Soul Reed. But because of Telethia's proximity spike during phase 3, you're gonna have to be pretty careful in using your cleanse arts quickly after you get debuffed, and making sure that you keep your use defensive stance when you start getting too low on HP. One of the other interesting dynamics between overdrive versus non-overdrive builds is that during an overdrive build, if you start an art animation and you want to get out of it to use another art like your cleanse, you really can't. You can just, with an overdrive build, you can just use overdrive and as a Gav's jail free card for just 3000 TP. But with a non-overdrive build, you really have to commit to every art you use because you don't really have an easy way to cancel out of them without... I guess you could run from the battle and then re-engage, but it's just a bit different and something that you should consider. I was thinking my aura's ended, so I'm going to want to go ahead and reactivate that. I think the soul reach should be getting a bit low by now. I've been wailing on it for a while. Go ahead and cleanse off the ether res down. I guess one of the other things I can mention now is that if I was going with a ranged build, I could, in theory, break through the soul reach faster, but because Blossom Dance is such a powerful art and Offensive Stance is such a powerful aura, you would really struggle with the other phases with keeping up with the damage of a Longsword, which is why I decided on Longsword for this. Also, that is the Soul Read down. It will probably take me 2 cycles of the Soul Read to kill Telethia because this build just does not have the same DPS as some of the other builds for the obvious reason. Pop Clarity Ray. As you can see, I took a ton of damage there off of the spike. Am I not targeting an appendage? I'm not doing much damage. No, I am. That's the ether is down, so I'm going to go ahead and cleanse that. I think I'm actually going to pop Defensive Stance for a little bit. Just to heal back up, stay safe, because if you get caught off guard by the ether is down, you can take tons of damage super fast in this build. It does not have a ton of HP, just because most of my investment with my augments and battle traits into other things. Go ahead and cleanse that off. As I said before, you really want to make sure you're keeping the Longsword out for this battle, just to keep getting your secondary cooldowns. And yeah, I don't know if there's a whole ton left to say. It's a pretty long battle just because the reduced damage of no overdrive, so I might just let the gameplay speak for itself for a little bit. And that is the battle. So this is a very different build than what I usually do in terms of this being a no overdrive build. But I hope that you were able to enjoy it nonetheless, and that maybe if you sat all the way through this, you were able to learn something about the mechanics of Xenoblade X and the differences between overdrive and non-overdrive builds, and you just found this interesting because this is a build that I am personally pretty proud of, and I personally find non-overdrive builds to be quite interesting, even though I don't usually enjoy using them myself. So that I will see you later, and if you have any questions or comments, just leave them down in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer them.